CEO's cruel mother branded her infertile. He signed the divorce papers, not knowing she was carrying his triplets, and then a great love story. I am sure you will like the ending. It is beyond your expectations. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. Before anything else, let me speak a prayer over your life. Not just words, but a covering of love for your heart, your home, and your soul. May the God of mercy walk into your life right now. May he silence every storm around you and whisper peace into every place that hurts. May he bless you with healing where you've been broken, joy where you've been weary, and love in the deepest parts of your spirit. May he lift your head gently, remind you of your worth, and fill your days with moments that feel like miracles. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You are deeply loved. Now, my sweet, beautiful family, you know I've been unwell lately. I can't use my voice today, but I'm still here, still writing, still pouring out my heart. And my dear brother James is lending his voice to help carry these words, but every line still comes from me, your Mr. Peter. And before we begin, I want to speak from the heart about something important. In some of my stories, I've lovingly described characters as a black woman. I want to be clear. I write those words with nothing but honor and admiration. If anyone misunderstood or felt hurt, please accept my heartfelt apology. I am not a racist. I never have been, and I never will be. In fact, my beautiful wife Binta is a strong, proud black woman, and her grace and power inspire everything I do. So I say it with deep love and respect. I see your beauty, I celebrate your strength, and now, all I ask, from one heart to another, is this. Please don't leave this story halfway. Watch it all the way through, every moment, every breath, because this isn't just a video, it's our connection. And right now, I need you close. Like the video, leave a comment, tell me you're still with me. Your support holds me while I heal, not just physically but emotionally too. I promise you, my family, I'll be back soon, stronger, brighter, with even deeper stories that honor your love. So now, take a deep breath, let your heart open wide, and let James begin the story. A story from my soul to yours.
5 years of marriage and still no heir. How embarrassing for you both. The crystal vase slipped from Elizabeth Helena's hands, shattering against the marble floor in a symphony of destruction that perfectly matched the moment her 5th wedding anniversary began to crumble. White peonies, their wedding flowers, symbols of honor and lasting love, scattered across the penthouse like fallen dreams, their petals mixing with sharp fragments that glittered in the morning sunlight. Standing in the doorway like an unwelcome omen, Cordelia Combs surveyed the wreckage with cold satisfaction, her silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon that hadn't moved in decades, her charcoal Chanel suit armor against any emotion that might dare to touch her. At 68, she wielded disappointment like a surgeon's blade, precise, devastating, and always aimed at the heart. Elizabeth's warm bronze skin seemed to glow with suppressed fury as she knelt to gather the broken pieces, her natural curls catching the light as she moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had learned to clean up messes that weren't her fault. The scent of her famous lavender pancakes still filled the kitchen, a mockery of the celebration that was supposed to mark half a decade of love conquering all. Mother. Billy Combs's voice cut through the tension like ice, but Elizabeth could hear the familiar weakness beneath the authority, the sound of a man who had never learned to choose between the woman he loved and the woman who had raised him. At 35, he still moved with the confidence of someone who commanded billion-dollar boardrooms. But in his mother's presence, he became that little boy desperate for approval. "Don't mother me, William." Cordelia stepped over the scattered flowers without a glance, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble like a countdown timer. "I've been patient. God knows I've been more patient than any woman should have to be, watching this farce continue year after year." Elizabeth rose slowly, a shard of crystal cutting into her palm, blood blooming bright against her skin. The pain was sharp and clean, nothing like the dull ache that had taken residence in her chest over the past 5 years of trying, hoping, failing, and pretending it didn't matter. At 32, she should have been designing nurseries instead of fertility clinic waiting rooms, should have been picking out tiny clothes instead of picking up the pieces of her shattered dreams every month. "You're bleeding," Billy said, reaching for her hand, but Elizabeth pulled away, wrapping her palm in a dish towel with the same careful control she'd learned to apply to everything in her life since marrying into the Combs dynasty. "I'm fine." The lie tasted like copper and disappointment. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for months, not since the morning sickness started 3 weeks ago. Symptoms she'd been afraid to acknowledge, afraid to hope for, afraid that this time would end like all the others in heartbreak and Cordelia's satisfied smirk. Cordelia pulled out a stack of glossy brochures like evidence in a trial where Elizabeth was the defendant. Dr. Morrison in Beverly Hills has achieved remarkable success rates, even with challenging cases, though perhaps we should consider that the issue might not be medical at all. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Elizabeth had endured 5 years of these surgical strikes, comments about her family's limited financial background, observations about her unusual career priorities, and now this latest assault on her very ability to create life. But today, with her secret growing inside her and her anniversary supposed to be about celebrating love, something inside her finally cracked. "Perhaps," Elizabeth said, her voice deadly quiet, "the issue is that it's impossible to conceive in a house where love is conditional and children are seen as business investments rather than blessings." The silence that followed was deafening. Billy's face went pale, caught between two women who had defined his world in entirely different ways. Cordelia's mask slipped, revealing raw fury beneath the polished exterior. "How dare you question me?" Cordelia hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Since her husband's death 3 years ago, she had clung to control like a drowning woman to driftwood, terrified that losing her grip on Billy would mean losing everything that gave her existence meaning. "This family has elevated you beyond your wildest dreams, from that cramped apartment above your grandmother's failing bakery to penthouses and private jets." Elizabeth's grandmother had been a proud woman who built something from nothing, who taught her that dignity was earned through character, not inherited through bank accounts. The bakery might have been small, but it had been filled with love, laughter, and the scent of fresh bread that brought the whole neighborhood together. It was more than Cordelia's mansion had ever been, a tomb of marble and crystal where love went to die. "That bakery," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, "taught me that family isn't about bloodlines or business empires. It's about showing up for each other when life gets hard, something this family seems to have forgotten." Billy stepped between them, his hands raised like a referee in a fight that had been brewing for 5 years. "Stop, both of you. This is our anniversary, for God's sake." But Cordelia wasn't finished. She moved closer to Elizabeth, close enough that her expensive perfume couldn't mask the scent of desperation beneath. "You think you're so noble, so pure. But my investigators have been busy, dear. Your father's business dealings weren't quite as honorable as you've led us to believe. Questionable financial practices, potential fraud charges that were conveniently dropped after his death. How do you think that would reflect on the Combs name if it became public knowledge?" The blood drained from Elizabeth's face. Her father had died when she was 15, leaving behind only debts and her grandmother's fierce protection of his memory. The idea that Cordelia would dig up old wounds, would threaten to destroy the memory of a man who couldn't defend himself, was cruelty beyond imagination. "You're lying," Elizabeth whispered, but doubt crept into her voice. Her father had been secretive about his work, always stressed about money, despite claiming his consulting business was successful. She had been too young to ask questions, too naive to see the signs that something wasn't right. Am I? Cordelia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I have documentation, Elizabeth. Bank records, witness statements, correspondence that paints a very unflattering picture of your family's financial ethics. Of course, these things could remain private, under the right circumstances. Billy's face went ashen as he realized what his mother was implying. You're blackmailing her. I'm protecting our family's reputation, Cordelia corrected, her voice as cold as a morgue. Something you seem incapable of doing yourself. The choice is simple, William. Your wife or your inheritance. Your fleeting infatuation or the legacy your father died building. Choose wisely, because I won't make this offer again. Elizabeth felt the world tilt on its axis. The nausea that had been plaguing her for weeks intensified, and she gripped the counter to stay upright. The secret she'd been carrying, the tiny spark of life growing inside her that she'd planned to share today with a romantic dinner and nervous excitement, suddenly felt like a burden too heavy to bear. "Billy," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the sound of her heart breaking, "tell her to leave." But Billy stood frozen, caught between the woman who had shaped his childhood and the woman who had defined his adulthood. His silence stretched like a chasm between them, filled with all the words he couldn't say, all the courage he couldn't find. Cordelia gathered her brochures with satisfaction, recognizing victory when she saw it. I'll give you 24 hours to decide, William. But understand this. I will not be replaced by a woman who can't even fulfill her most basic biological function. This family needs heirs, not excuses. She swept toward the elevator, pausing only to deliver one final blow. Oh, and Elizabeth? Happy anniversary. I do hope it's your last. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime that sounded like a death knell. Elizabeth stood among the scattered peonies and broken crystal, one hand pressed to her stomach where their secret grew, the other covering her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Billy reached for her, but she stepped away, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. "Don't," she whispered. "Just don't." "Elizabeth, I'm sorry. She had no right." "She had every right," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice hollow. "This is her house, her family, her son. I'm just the woman foolish enough to think love could be enough." She walked toward their bedroom, her bare feet silent on the cold marble, leaving Billy standing alone among the wreckage of their anniversary morning. Behind her, the pancakes burned on the stove, filling the penthouse with the acrid scent of dreams turning to ash. Billy stared at the closed bedroom door, his mother's ultimatum echoing in his ears. 24 hours to choose between the only two women who had ever mattered to him. 24 hours to decide whether love was worth losing everything he'd been raised to value. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the city, and Billy couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the tempest that would tear his world apart. Chapter 2. The Evidence Builds. 3 weeks had passed since Cordelia's ultimatum, and Elizabeth's world was slowly crumbling from the inside out. She stood in the center of Magnolia Bay Children's Hospital, her latest architectural project, watching construction workers pour the foundation for a pediatric wing designed to heal broken little bodies. The irony wasn't lost on her, creating spaces for children while her own secret grew larger each day, a tiny life she couldn't yet acknowledge aloud. "Mrs. Combs, the contractors need your approval on the stained glass windows for the main entrance," called Jake Morrison, the site foreman, his hard hat dusty from morning work. Elizabeth nodded, pulling blueprints from her leather portfolio with hands that trembled. The morning sickness had evolved into bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement feel like swimming through honey. 8 weeks along now, She'd finally summoned courage to take 3 different pregnancy tests, all blazing with positive results that should have brought joy but instead left her terrified. "The children should see something beautiful when they arrive," she murmured, tracing the design with her finger. Rainbow butterflies and soaring birds, symbols of hope and healing. Something that reminds them that broken things can become beautiful again. If only she believed that about her own life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Billy. "Dinner tonight? 8 p.m. at Chez Laurent? We need to talk." Elizabeth stared at the message, her heart clenching. Billy had been distant since his mother's visit, staying late at the office, sleeping in the guest room under the excuse of not wanting to wake her with his restless nights. But Elizabeth knew the truth. He was avoiding her while he wrestled with an impossible choice between the woman he loved and the empire he'd been born to inherit. "Elizabeth Helena, as I live and breathe." The voice belonged to Aurora Mills, a woman whose silver hair gleamed despite being only 45, and whose reputation as both the town's premier midwife and most efficient gossip preceded her like a storm warning. Aurora approached with the confident stride of someone who considered everyone else's business her own personal entertainment. "Aurora," Elizabeth managed, forcing a smile, "what brings you to the construction site?" "Oh, just driving by and saw your car. Thought I'd stop and see how our future children's hospital is coming along." Aurora's eyes were sharp, calculating, taking in Elizabeth's pale complexion and the way she gripped the blueprint a little too tightly. "You know, you look a bit peaked, dear. Been feeling under the weather lately?" Elizabeth's blood chilled. Aurora Mills could spot a pregnancy from 3 counties away, and right now Elizabeth needed to keep her secret safe more than she needed her next breath. "Just tired. The project is demanding." Aurora stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, I've been hearing the most interesting stories about your family, Elizabeth. Stories that make a person wonder about the kind of people the Combs family associates with." "What kind of stories?" Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. Aurora glanced around dramatically, ensuring they were alone among the construction equipment. "Well, I hate to repeat gossip, but that lovely Mrs. Combs, Billy's mother, she's been asking questions around town about your late father's business dealings. Seems there might have been some irregularities in his financial practices back in the day." Elizabeth felt the world tilt. "That's impossible. My father was an honest man." "Oh, I'm sure he was, dear. I'm sure he was." Aurora's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "But you know how these things go. Sometimes honest men get caught up in complicated situations. Sometimes they make choices that look bad in hindsight. And sometimes—" She leaned even closer, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. "Sometimes those choices come back to haunt their children." The implication hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Aurora wasn't just spreading idle gossip, she was delivering a message. Cordelia had gotten to her, probably with money, possibly with threats, definitely with the promise of more juicy information to fuel Aurora's addiction to other people's drama. "Mrs. Mills," Elizabeth said carefully, "I think there's been some misunderstanding." "Oh, no misunderstanding at all, sweetie. I've seen the documentation myself. Bank records, correspondence, witness statements. Very thorough work, very professional investigation. Makes a person wonder what else might come to light if someone really started digging." Elizabeth's knees nearly buckled. The baby, her precious secret, suddenly felt like it was growing in a body that belonged to someone else, someone whose entire foundation was built on lies she'd never known existed. "What do you want?" Elizabeth whispered. Aurora's smile was predatory. "Oh, I don't want anything, dear. I'm just a messenger. But if I were you, I'd be thinking very carefully about the future, about what's best for everyone involved, about whether holding on to something that's causing so much trouble is really worth the price everyone else has to pay." She patted Elizabeth's arm with false sympathy before walking away, her heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown timer. Elizabeth stood frozen among the construction chaos, one hand pressed to her stomach, where life was blooming, even as her world was dying. An hour later, Elizabeth sat in her car outside Jasper Quinn's art gallery, staring at the phone number Aurora had slipped into her hand before leaving. The same number that had called her 3 times in the past week, always hanging up when she answered. Now she understood why. Jasper emerged from his gallery, his artist's uniform of paint-stained jeans and vintage band t-shirt, making him look younger than his 38 years. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, his kind eyes shadowed with the weight of dreams deferred and bills that never seemed to get smaller. "Elizabeth." He approached her car with concern written across his features. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Jasper, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Elizabeth rolled down her window, her voice steadier than she felt. "Has anyone been asking you questions about me, about my family?" Jasper's face went pale, confirming her worst fears before he even spoke. "Elizabeth, how much did she pay you?" The question hung between them like a blade. Jasper's shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked every one of his 38 years, plus a few more. "My gallery is 3 months behind on rent. The bank is threatening foreclosure on my apartment. She offered to cover everything and give me enough to stay afloat for 6 months. In exchange for what? Information about your father's old business, about any financial troubles he might have had, about whether you ever mentioned anything suspicious about his death or his affairs." Jasper's voice was barely above a whisper. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry. I needed the money, and she made it sound like she was just concerned about her son's future, like she wanted to make sure there weren't any surprises that could hurt the family." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling another piece of her life crumble away. Jasper had been one of the few people in Billy's social circle who had treated her like a real person instead of an interesting accessory. His betrayal cut deeper because it came from someone she had trusted. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing, because I don't know anything. Your father died when you were 15, and you never talked about his work except to say he was a business consultant. But Elizabeth—" Jasper reached through the window, his hand covering hers. "She has other people looking too, professional investigators. People who can find things that maybe should stay buried." Elizabeth pulled her hand away, starting her car with mechanical precision. "Thank you for telling me the truth. And Jasper, stay away from me. Whatever she's paying you, it's not worth destroying an innocent person's life." She drove away, leaving Jasper standing in front of his gallery with guilt written across his face and Cordelia's money burning in his pocket. That evening, Elizabeth sat across from Billy at Chez Laurent, the restaurant where he had proposed 5 years ago. The table was set with white linens and flickering candles, but the romance felt forced, desperate, like a dying patient trying to pretend they were healthy. "You've been quiet tonight," Billy said, cutting his steak with mechanical precision. "Everything all right?" Elizabeth looked at her husband, really looked at him. The man who had swept her off her feet with his passion for sustainable technology and his dreams of changing the world. The man who now couldn't meet her eyes because he was slowly, methodically, choosing his inheritance over their marriage. "Billy," she said quietly, "if I told you I was pregnant, what would you say?" The fork froze halfway to his mouth. Hope and terror warred across his features in equal measure. "Are you?" "I'm asking hypothetically." Billy set down his fork, leaning forward with an intensity that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him. "I would say it changes everything. I would say that mother be damned, inheritance be damned. We're going to be a family and nothing else matters." Elizabeth nodded slowly, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. And if your mother threatened to destroy everything we've built unless you chose between me and our baby or your family's legacy. Billy's face went ashen. Elizabeth, what are you asking me? I'm asking if you're strong enough to choose love over fear, Billy. Because that choice is coming sooner than you think. And I need to know if the man I married is still in there somewhere or if your mother has already won. She stood, leaving her dinner untouched, and her husband sitting alone with the weight of a question that would define both their futures. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning like a death sentence wrapped in expensive cream paper. Billy stared at it across his mahogany desk, the Combs Industries logo embossed in gold at the top, his mother's elegant handwriting spelling out his name in ink that probably cost more than most people's daily wages. He'd been avoiding this moment for weeks, ever since Elizabeth's hypothetical question at dinner had confirmed his worst fears, that his wife might actually be pregnant, and that his mother's ultimatum was about to become devastatingly real. Outside his corner office, Seattle's skyline stretched gray and endless under autumn clouds. But Billy saw none of it. All he could see was the envelope that contained either his freedom or his family's destruction. His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Combs, Mrs. Combs, your mother is here to see you." "Send her in," Billy managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. Cordelia entered his office like she owned it, which, technically, she did. At 68, she moved with the predatory grace of someone who had spent decades making impossible choices seem inevitable. Today she wore navy blue Armani, her silver hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. She looked like victory, and Billy realized with crushing clarity that she probably was. "Open it," she said without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from his desk like a judge taking the bench. Billy's hands shook as he broke the seal. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance photos of his father-in-law, Elizabeth's father, meeting with men in expensive suits outside what looked like a federal building, bank statements showing large cash deposits and immediate withdrawals, copies of FBI documents marked "Investigation Pending," with his father-in-law's name highlighted in yellow. "These are 30 years old," Billy said, his voice hollow. "He's been dead for 17 years. Age doesn't make fraud less fraudulent, William. It just makes the victims' families angrier when they finally learn the truth." Cordelia crossed her legs, her posture radiating satisfaction. Richard Helena was laundering money for the Torino crime family. The FBI was building a case when he conveniently died in that car accident, though some might say the timing was suspiciously convenient. Billy's world tilted. Elizabeth's father, the man she remembered as a loving father who worked too hard and died too young, had been a criminal. The car accident that left 15-year-old Elizabeth devastated and financially desperate hadn't been random tragedy. It had been an escape from federal prosecution. "You're suggesting he killed himself to avoid charges?" "I'm stating facts documented by federal investigators." Cordelia leaned forward, her voice dropping to the deadly whisper she used for killing blows. "Facts that would devastate Elizabeth if they became public. Facts that would destroy her architectural firm when clients learned she built her reputation on blood money inherited from a money launderer. Facts that would make the Combs family synonymous with organized crime in every newspaper and business journal nationwide." Billy flipped through more documents, witness statements describing Richard Helena as a key financial operative, evidence of shell companies and offshore accounts, testimony from federal informants placing him at meetings with known mobsters. But something nagged at him. As CEO of a tech company, Billy had learned to spot sophisticated forgeries, and these documents felt too perfect, too convenient. "Mother, I need to verify this independently. I'll have my security team." "There's no time for verification, William." Cordelia's voice turned ice cold. I've already scheduled a press conference for Friday morning. The story goes public in 72 hours, unless you sign those papers and distance our family from this scandal before it breaks. Billy's blood chilled. You're going to destroy an innocent woman based on documents you won't let me authenticate? I'm protecting our family's reputation before it's too late. The media won't care if the evidence is perfect. They'll care that there's enough smoke to assume fire. Elizabeth's career will be destroyed. Our name will be linked to organized crime, and you'll lose everything your father died building. Cordelia's smile was razor-sharp. Unless, of course, you're divorced and publicly separated from her before the story breaks. Billy opened the folder with numb fingers. Divorce papers, already prepared by the best family lawyers money could buy. Terms that were more generous than Elizabeth had any right to expect. A settlement that would set her up for life, provided she signed a non-disclosure agreement and disappeared from Seattle permanently. She's pregnant, Billy said quietly. Cordelia's mask slipped for just a moment, surprise flickering across her perfect features before the steel returned. Are you certain? Number. She asked me a hypothetical question, but Billy rubbed his face, suddenly feeling older than his 35 years. The way she's been acting lately, the way she looks. I think she is. Then this is even more urgent than I thought. Cordelia's voice turned arctic. Do you want to raise a child whose grandfather was a criminal? Do you want our grandchildren to grow up with that legacy? Do you want to explain to them someday why their mother's family history makes them targets for every rival business family and federal investigation? Billy stared at the papers, his vision blurring. I love her. Love is a luxury we can't afford, William. Your father loved me, but he also understood that some sacrifices are necessary to protect what matters most. The Combs name, the Combs legacy, the empire we've built. These things are bigger than any one person's happiness. And if I refuse, Cordelia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, then I release everything to the media. Elizabeth's father's criminal activities, the money laundering, the mob connections, the suspicious circumstances of his death. I've already prepared press releases for the Times, the Post, the Journal, and every major business publication. Your wife's reputation will be destroyed, her business will collapse, and the Combs name will be dragged through the mud alongside hers. She stood, smoothing her skirt with mechanical precision. I'm not the villain here, William. I'm the woman who's willing to make the hard choices to protect this family. Elizabeth will survive. She's stronger than she looks, and the settlement will ensure she never wants for anything. But if you choose her over us, if you choose love over legacy, then you'll destroy not just your own future, but hers as well. Billy stared at the divorce papers until the words blurred together. His mother was right. She was always right when it came to protecting the family's interests. Elizabeth would be devastated by the divorce, but she would survive. She might even be better off without the weight of the Combs legacy crushing her dreams. But if the truth about her father came out, if her name was linked to organized crime and money laundering, it would destroy everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built from nothing after her father's death. 24 hours, Cordelia said, moving toward the door. Sign the papers and file them by tomorrow night, or I release everything to the press Thursday morning. Choose wisely, William. Some doors, once closed, can never be opened again. She left Billy alone with the documents that would either save his marriage or destroy his wife's life. Outside, Seattle's autumn rain began to fall like tears against his office windows. Billy spent the rest of the day staring at the papers, calling Elizabeth twice and hanging up before she answered, drafting and deleting a dozen text messages that all said the same thing. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I love you, but I can't save us both. That evening, he found Elizabeth in their bathroom, face pale with exhaustion, one hand pressed to her stomach, in a gesture that confirmed his worst fears and deepest hopes simultaneously. She was pregnant. He could see it in the careful way she moved, the protective curve of her posture, the secret glow that motherhood brought even in its earliest stages. "How was your day?" she asked, not meeting his eyes in the mirror as she brushed her teeth. "Fine," Billy lied, the divorce papers burning in his briefcase like evidence of a crime he hadn't yet committed, but knew he would. Elizabeth nodded, rinsing her mouth with the mechanical movements of someone going through familiar motions while their world crumbled around them. "I'm tired. I think I'll go to bed early." "Elizabeth," Billy started, but she was already walking toward their bedroom, her bare feet silent on the marble floors. "Good night, Billy," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the weight of someone who already knew their marriage was ending but couldn't bring herself to say it aloud. Billy stood in the bathroom doorway, watching his pregnant wife prepare for what might be their last night together, the divorce papers calling to him from his briefcase like a siren song of destruction and salvation. At 2 a.m., while Elizabeth slept fitfully beside him, Billy crept to his study and signed the papers with a hand that shook so badly he could barely hold the pen. He told himself he was protecting her, that sacrificing their marriage was better than sacrificing her entire future. He told himself that love sometimes meant letting go, that his mother was right about impossible choices requiring impossible sacrifices. But as he sealed the documents in an envelope and set them on his desk for filing the next morning, Billy knew the truth. He wasn't protecting Elizabeth. He was choosing fear over love, legacy over family, his mother's approval over his wife's trust. And somewhere in the darkness of their bedroom, Elizabeth stirred in her sleep, one hand moving unconsciously to her stomach, where their children, three tiny miracles she didn't yet know about, grew steadily toward a world that was about to shatter around them all. Chapter 4. The Discovery. Elizabeth Helena stared at 3 pregnancy tests lined up on the marble bathroom counter like tiny prophets delivering the same miraculous message. Pregnant, pregnant, pregnant. Her hands trembled as she picked up the digital test, spelling out the impossible truth. Pregnant 2 to 3 weeks. But Dr. Reeves had been wrong. The ultrasound appointment she'd secretly scheduled for this morning revealed she was actually 8 weeks along, and the technician's shocked expression had prepared her for news that defied every fertility specialist's predictions. "Triplets," she whispered to her reflection, her skin glowing with the radiance that comes from creating not one, but 3 lives, 3 babies. The ultrasound photos were tucked safely in her purse, 3 tiny peanut-shaped miracles swimming in separate sacs, their heartbeats strong and synchronized like a triumphant symphony. After 5 years of negative tests, empty cycles, and Cordelia's cutting remarks about her inadequacy, Elizabeth was carrying not just one heir to the Combs legacy, but 3. She pressed both hands to her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the secret growing inside her. Billy would be ecstatic. She knew it with the same certainty she knew her own name. He would probably cry, might even call in sick, to work just to hold her and talk about nursery designs and tiny clothes and all the dreams they'd carefully packed away after too many disappointments. Today was Wednesday. Billy would be coming home early from the office, and she had planned the perfect reveal. The vintage music box that played their wedding song was wrapped in tissue paper, the ultrasound photos tucked inside like the most precious treasure in the world. She would cook his favorite dinner, open a bottle of sparkling cider, and watch his face transform when he realized their family was about to grow exponentially. Elizabeth practically floated down the hallway toward Billy's study, her steps light with the kind of joy she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to use his computer to research triplet pregnancies, to understand what the next 8 months would bring, to start planning for the beautiful chaos of 3 babies arriving at once. The study door was slightly ajar, morning sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating Billy's mahogany desk, where he kept his most important documents. Elizabeth pushed the door open with a smile on her lips and her hand resting protectively over their secret. The smile died when she saw the papers. Divorce documents, crisp, official, bearing the letterhead of Preston, Walsh and Associates, the most expensive family law firm in Seattle. Her name was spelled out in black ink, alongside Billy's, their 5-year marriage reduced to legal terminology and asset division clauses. Elizabeth's legs gave out, and she sank into Billy's leather chair, the ultrasound photos sliding from her numb fingers to scatter across the desk beside the papers that would end their marriage. The contrast was devastating. Images of new life lying next to documents of death, hope and despair occupying the same space like a cruel, cosmic joke. She picked up the papers with hands that felt disconnected from her body, reading through terms that were almost insultingly generous. Billy was giving her everything. The penthouse, a settlement that would set her up for life, all of her architectural equipment and designs. Everything except the one thing that mattered: his love, his trust, his willingness to fight for their family. There was a note attached in Billy's careful handwriting. Elizabeth, I know you'll never understand this, but I'm doing this to protect you. There are things about your family's past that could destroy your future, and I won't let that happen. You deserve better than the life I can give you. Please don't try to find me. B. Star. Elizabeth read the note 3 times before the words penetrated her shock. Her family's past? What could Billy possibly know about her family that she didn't? Her father had been a business consultant who died in a car accident when she was 15. Her mother had left when Elizabeth was 5, leaving her to be raised by her grandmother in the apartment above the family bakery. There were no dark secrets, no skeletons in closets, just ordinary people living ordinary lives, until tragedy struck. Unless Elizabeth's blood turned to ice as she remembered Aurora Mill's veiled threats at the construction site, her knowing smirks and carefully worded implications about questionable financial practices. Cordelia had been digging into her family's history, and somehow she'd found something, or created something, that gave her the leverage she needed to destroy Elizabeth's marriage. The music box sat on the desk like a monument to dreams deferred, its cheerful wrapping paper obscene in the context of divorce documents and shattered trust. Elizabeth opened it with mechanical movements, and their wedding song began to play, a haunting melody that had once promised forever but now sounded like a funeral dirge. She gathered the ultrasound photos with infinite care, studying the 3 tiny shapes that would never know their father's love, because he'd chosen fear over family, legacy over the lives growing inside her. The irony was devastating. After 5 years of desperately wanting children, she was finally carrying triplets. But the man who'd helped create them had already decided they weren't worth fighting for. Elizabeth pulled out a piece of Billy's personal stationery and began to write, her tears smearing the ink, but her hand steady with the kind of calm that comes from absolute despair. Billy, I came home to tell you the most wonderful news of our lives. We're having 3 babies, triplets, healthy and strong, due in 7 months. I had planned to surprise you with dinner and champagne and the ultrasound photos that show our children growing inside me. Instead, I found divorce papers and a note telling me you're protecting me from some terrible family secret I know nothing about. You've decided our marriage isn't worth fighting for before you even told me what we're fighting against. I won't chase you. I won't beg you to choose your family over whatever threats your mother has made this time. Our children will grow up knowing their father existed, but they'll never know the coward who signed these papers while they were being created in my body. Don't contact me. Don't send lawyers or mediators or money. I'll raise them alone, and I'll make sure they understand that sometimes love isn't enough, and sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. I loved you with everything I had. I hope whatever you chose instead of us was worth it. Elizabeth. P.S. The babies are due in April. If you change your mind about being their father, you'll know where to find us. But don't come unless you're ready to fight for us the way I've been fighting for you for 5 years." She sealed the letter in an envelope, along with 2 of the ultrasound photos, keeping one for herself as proof that miracles could happen even when hearts were breaking, and left it on top of the divorce papers where Billy would find it when he came home. Moving through their penthouse felt like walking through a museum of a life that no longer belonged to her. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every carefully chosen detail that had made their house a home now felt like evidence of her own naivety. She'd believed in forever when Billy had only been thinking in terms of until something better comes along. Elizabeth packed quickly and efficiently, taking only what belonged to her before their marriage: her grandmother's quilts, her architectural tools, the few pieces of jewelry that had survived her father's death and her mother's abandonment. She left behind everything Billy had given her, every designer dress and expensive accessory that had been meant to transform her into someone worthy of the Combs name. As she loaded her car in the building's private garage, Elizabeth caught sight of herself in the side mirror. Her warm bronze skin looked ashen, her usually bright eyes red-rimmed and hollow. But beneath the devastation, something else was growing, not just the 3 lives in her womb, but a fierce determination to build something better from the wreckage of her marriage. She drove away from Seattle as the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting protectively over her stomach, where Billy's children grew, unaware that their father had already chosen his mother's approval over their existence. In her rearview mirror, the city where she'd found love and lost it disappeared into the distance. But Elizabeth didn't look back. She was driving toward an uncertain future with 3 tiny passengers who would need her to be stronger than she'd ever been before, braver than she'd ever imagined possible, and more fiercely protective than a mother bear defending her cubs. The coastal highway stretched ahead like a promise of new beginnings, and for the first time in years, Elizabeth felt truly free, free from Cordelia's poison, free from Billy's weakness, free to love her children without condition or compromise. 7 hours later, as twilight settled over the small coastal town of Magnolia Bay, Elizabeth pulled into the driveway of a cottage she'd rented sight unseen through an online listing. The house was small and weathered, with blue shutters and a garden that had gone wild with neglect, but it faced the ocean and felt like sanctuary. She sat in her car for a long moment, one hand pressed to her stomach, listening to the sound of waves against the shore and feeling her children move for the first time, tiny flutters like butterfly wings announcing their presence. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to them, to herself, to the universe that had taken away her husband, but given her 3 reasons to rebuild her life from the ground up. "We're going to be better than okay. We're going to be extraordinary." Chapter 5. 7 months later. The desperate attempts. Elizabeth Helena stood at the edge of Magnolia Bay's weekly farmers market, her hand resting protectively over her dramatically expanded belly, where 3 babies had transformed her into something magnificent and formidable. At nearly 8 months pregnant with triplets, she moved with the deliberate caution of someone carrying the most precious cargo imaginable, her skin glowing with the radiance that comes from nurturing multiple lives. The morning was crisp and bright, the kind of October day that made the coastal town feel like something from a fairy tale. Vendors called out prices for pumpkins and apple cider, children ran between stalls with sticky fingers and bright laughter, and Elizabeth felt more at peace than she had in years, despite the exhaustion that came from carrying 3 rapidly growing babies. "Elizabeth, dear, you're positively glowing," called Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the flower stall. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Like I'm growing a small army," Elizabeth replied with a smile, accepting the bouquet of autumn flowers Mrs. Patterson pressed into her hands. "Doctor, Chen says they're all healthy and strong, which means I'm probably not sleeping for the next 5 years." The joke felt natural now, this casual discussion of her future as a single mother. 7 months in Magnolia Bay had healed wounds Elizabeth hadn't even known she was carrying. The town had welcomed her without question, embracing her and her unconventional situation with the kind of warmth that came from communities who understood that families came in all shapes and sizes. Aurora Mills, who had turned out to be a different person entirely, once freed from Cordelia's money and influence, had become an unexpected friend and advocate. Jasper Quinn had followed Elizabeth to Magnolia Bay, using Cordelia's guilt money to open a small gallery where he displayed his honest work instead of feeding information to manipulative mothers-in-law. Even the local doctor, Marcus Chen, had become a steady presence in Elizabeth's life, his quiet kindness a balm after Billy's cowardice. "Elizabeth," a familiar voice called from across the market square, and Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. Billy Combs stood beside a gleaming black Mercedes, looking completely out of place among the farmers and fishermen in his $1,000 suit and Italian leather shoes. 7 months had aged him. His dark hair was shot through with premature silver, his face was gaunt with what looked like sleepless nights, and his usually confident posture was hunched with the weight of regret. But what caught Elizabeth's attention wasn't Billy's obvious suffering. It was the ridiculous display he'd arranged around his car. Dozens of white roses covered the vehicle's surface. A string quartet was setting up near the gazebo, and what appeared to be a jewelry store's worth of boxes sat on a table covered in silk. The entire market fell silent, conversations dying as everyone turned to stare at the spectacle. Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from fury that Billy would dare to turn her sanctuary into a stage for his guilt-driven dramatics. "Elizabeth, please," Billy called, walking toward her with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "I know you said not to contact you, but I had to—" "Stop right there," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet market. Every eye was on them now, the entire town witnessing what was about to unfold. "You have 30 seconds to explain what you're doing here before I call Sheriff Morrison to escort you back to whatever rock you crawled out from under." Billy's face crumpled at her coldness, but he pressed on with the desperation of a drowning man. "I made a mistake, the biggest mistake of my life. I've spent 7 months realizing what I lost, what I threw away, and I'm here to make it right." He gestured toward the expensive display, his voice growing stronger as he fell back on the only tactics he knew. "I liquidated my personal investments to buy you that house, the Victorian on Cliff Road that you admired when you first got to town, the jewelry, the medical team. I sold everything I could to show you this isn't about my family's money anymore. It's about us." "You think you can buy me back?" Elizabeth's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried to every corner of the market. "You think liquidating your portfolio makes up for liquidating our marriage?" Billy stopped in his tracks, finally seeming to realize that his corporate approach to problem-solving wasn't working on the woman whose heart he'd shattered. "Elizabeth, I know I hurt you, but if you'll just let me explain—" "Explain what? How you signed divorce papers while I was carrying your children? How you chose your mother's threats over your family's future? How you decided I wasn't worth fighting for before you even told me what we were fighting against?" Elizabeth's voice rose with each word, 7 months of suppressed pain and fury finally finding their voice. The babies moved restlessly in her womb, responding to their mother's elevated emotions, and Elizabeth pressed both hands to her belly in a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. "You hurt those babies before they were even born," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "You made them orphans while they were still in my body because you were too much of a coward to stand up to your mother." Aurora Mills stepped up beside Elizabeth, her arm sliding protectively around her friend's shoulders. "I think you should leave," she said to Billy, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades helping women through the hardest moments of their lives. "This is between me and my wife," Billy said, desperation making his voice sharp. "Ex-wife," Elizabeth corrected coldly. "Those papers you signed made that very clear. And these babies?" She rubbed her belly with fierce protectiveness. "They're mine. You gave up any claim to them when you chose your inheritance over their existence." Billy's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down his face as he realized the magnitude of what he'd lost. "Elizabeth, please. I love you. I love them. I made a terrible mistake, but we can fix this. We can—" "Love?" Elizabeth laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You want to talk about love? Love doesn't abandon. Love doesn't choose convenience over commitment. Love doesn't sign divorce papers and leave notes like a coward instead of fighting for what matters most." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than all her shouting. "You can't buy back a broken heart with your credit card, Billy. Our children deserve a father who fights for love, not one who buys his way out of guilt. Take your roses and your jewelry and your empty gestures and go back to your mother. You made your choice 7 months ago." Billy reached toward her, but Elizabeth stepped back, Aurora and Jasper, who had appeared from nowhere, forming a protective wall around her. "Don't," she said simply. "Don't touch me, don't follow me, and don't ever come back here thinking that money can fix what you destroyed with your cowardice." She turned and walked away, leaving Billy standing among his expensive props like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. The crowd parted for her, offering supportive smiles and protective glances that made it clear where their loyalties lay. Behind her, she heard Billy calling her name, heard the desperation in his voice as he realized his grand gesture had failed spectacularly. But Elizabeth didn't look back. She'd learned that looking back only showed you what you'd lost, while looking forward showed you what you could still build. That evening, Elizabeth sat on her cottage porch, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. The babies were active tonight, 3 little dancers putting on a show that made her breathless with their acrobatics. "Your daddy came to visit today," she told them, her hands tracing the complex choreography of their movements. "He brought roses and jewelry and promises he's 7 months too late to make. But don't worry, I sent him away. We don't need men who run when things get hard." Dr. Marcus Chen arrived just as the last light was fading from the sky, carrying his medical bag and the gentle smile that had become such a comfort over the past few months. He was everything Billy wasn't: steady, reliable, present when his promises mattered most. "I heard there was some excitement at the farmer's market today," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside her with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become part of her chosen family. "Billy came to town with a traveling jewelry store and a string quartet," Elizabeth said dryly. "I sent him home with his tail between his legs and strict instructions not to come back." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good. You and these babies deserve better than someone who only shows up when guilt gets too heavy to carry alone." Elizabeth smiled, feeling the babies settle into calm as darkness fell over Magnolia Bay. "We're going to be just fine," she said, and for the first time since finding those divorce papers, she truly believed it. Somewhere in the distance, Billy's Mercedes was probably carrying him back to Seattle, back to his mother's cold approval and his empty penthouse. But Elizabeth was exactly where she belonged, in a place where love wasn't conditional, where families were chosen rather than inherited, and where 3 little miracles were getting ready to change the world just by existing in it. Chapter 6. The Medical Crisis. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth sat in her cottage reading room, trying to focus on architectural plans while 3 babies performed what felt like synchronized swimming routines in her belly. The exhaustion was overwhelming now. Every movement required deliberate effort, and Dr. Chen had warned her that bed rest might become necessary if her blood pressure didn't stabilize. A soft knock at her door interrupted her concentration. She opened it to find Billy standing on her porch, no flashy displays or expensive gifts in sight. He wore simple jeans and a sweater, his hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it for hours. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "I know you don't want to see me, but something's happened, something you need to know about." The seriousness in his voice made her step aside and let him in. Billy moved to her living room but didn't sit, instead pacing like a caged animal. "I hired investigators," he said without preamble. "Real ones this time, not my mother's people. The evidence about your father, all of it was fabricated. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of proof she showed me was professionally forged." Elizabeth sank into her rocking chair, one hand pressed to her belly where the babies had suddenly gone still, as if sensing their mother's shock. "You're telling me you destroyed our marriage over lies? I'm telling you my mother is a master manipulator who played on my worst fears and biggest weaknesses. I'm telling you I was a coward who chose the easy path instead of fighting for what mattered most." Billy stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "I'm telling you I've spent the last month trying to undo the damage, trying to find evidence that could clear your father's name and prove what really happened." "And what really happened?" Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. "Your father was exactly who you thought he was, a good man who worked hard to support his family and died in a tragic accident. My mother's investigators created an entire fictional criminal history to give her leverage over me." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling a pain deeper than physical discomfort. "Billy, even if that's true." A sharp contraction cut through her words, stealing her breath. She gripped the chair arms, waiting for it to pass, but another one followed almost immediately. "Elizabeth." Billy was beside her in an instant, his hand hovering over hers. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Just, just Braxton Hicks. False labor." But even as she said it, Elizabeth knew something was different. These contractions were stronger, more regular than anything she'd experienced before. Billy pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Chen." "No, Billy, I'm fine." Another contraction hit, this one strong enough to make her cry out. When it passed, Elizabeth looked down to see fluid soaking through her dress. Oh no, 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 it's too early." The mariachi band launched into Cielito Lindo just as Billy stepped through the community center doors, his usually perfect hair disheveled from what appeared to be a sleepless night. He wore jeans and a rumpled button-down shirt instead of his typical armor of expensive suits, and Elizabeth might have found the change appealing if she weren't so furious about his latest publicity stunt. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice hoarse with desperation, "I know this looks crazy, but I needed to show you how serious I am about making this right." "Serious?" Elizabeth's voice rose above the mariachi music, drawing stares from everyone in the building. "You think hiring a mariachi band and a skywriter shows you're serious? You think grand gestures make up for abandoning your pregnant wife?" Billy flinched at the word abandoning, but pressed on with the determination of someone who'd run out of other options. "I've been investigating the evidence my mother showed me about your father. I hired 3 different private investigators, and they all found the same thing. The documents were fabricated. Your father wasn't a criminal, Elizabeth. The FBI files were forgeries, the bank records were fake, even the witness statements were paid lies." Elizabeth's breath caught. Part of her had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still felt like being punched in the chest. "You're telling me you destroyed our marriage over lies?" "I'm telling you my mother is a master manipulator who played on my worst fears and biggest weaknesses. I'm telling you I was a coward who chose the easy path instead of fighting for what mattered most." Billy stepped closer, his voice breaking. "I'm telling you I've spent the last month trying to undo the damage, trying to make it right, trying to—" "Stop!" Elizabeth's shout echoed through the community center, and the mariachi band finally fell silent. Just stop. You think this is about evidence and investigations and proving your mother wrong? You think this is about clearing my father's name or exposing her lies? The babies kicked hard, as if responding to their mother's elevated emotions, and Elizabeth gasped, one hand flying to her belly. This is about trust, Billy. This is about the fact that when your family was threatened, your first instinct was to sacrifice me instead of fighting for us. This is about the fact that you signed divorce papers while I was carrying your children and never even gave me the chance to face whatever was coming together. Pain shot through her lower back, sharp and urgent, and Elizabeth gripped the doorframe for support. Something was wrong. The baby's movements had changed from restless to frantic, and the familiar tightening in her abdomen was becoming more frequent and intense. Elizabeth? Aurora's voice seemed to come from very far away. Honey, you need to sit down right now. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. 7 months of suppressed rage and heartbreak came pouring out like a dam bursting. Love whispers, Billy. It doesn't shout from rooftops or hire skywriters or interrupt prenatal yoga classes with mariachi bands. Love is quiet and steady and present when it matters most. Love is... The contraction hit like a freight train, doubling her over with pain so intense it stole her breath. Elizabeth felt something warm and wet between her legs, and she looked down to see fluid pooling on the community center floor. My water just broke, she whispered, and then louder with the kind of terror that could only come from a woman whose babies were 10 weeks too early. My water just broke. The community center erupted into controlled chaos. Aurora was instantly at Elizabeth's side, her midwife training taking over as she guided Elizabeth to a chair and began timing contractions. Sarah Fletcher was on her phone calling 911 while the other pregnant women cleared space and offered blankets and comfort. Billy stood frozen for a moment, watching the woman he loved begin premature labor with their children before his paralysis broke and he was suddenly in motion. Where's the hospital? How far? Should we wait for an ambulance or... Magnolia Bay Hospital is 20 minutes away, but they don't have a NICU, Aurora said tersely, her hands checking Elizabeth's pulse and breathing. Portland has the closest Level 3 facility, but that's 45 minutes by car, 20 by helicopter. Then get the helicopter, Billy said with the authority of someone accustomed to making impossible things happen. I don't care what it costs. Another contraction hit, and Elizabeth cried out, gripping Aurora's hand hard enough to leave marks. It's too early, she gasped. They're not ready. They need more time. Babies born at 32 weeks have excellent survival rates, Aurora said firmly, though Elizabeth could see the worry in her eyes. Especially with good medical care. You're going to be fine, and so are they. Billy knelt beside Elizabeth's chair, his hands hovering over her as if he wanted to touch her but didn't dare. Elizabeth, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. The stress, the confrontation. Don't, Elizabeth managed between contractions. Don't you dare blame yourself for this. Triplet pregnancies end early all the time. This isn't about you. But even as she said it, Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder if the emotional upheaval of Billy's return had triggered what her body was already primed to do. Dr. Chen had warned her that stress could precipitate early labor, and she'd been under enormous strain since Billy's first appearance at the farmer's market. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air, and suddenly the community center was flooded with paramedics and medical equipment. Elizabeth found herself being transferred to a stretcher, monitors attached to her belly, tracking 3 separate heartbeats that were strong, but too fast, too urgent. "Sir, are you the father?" one of the paramedics asked Billy. Billy looked at Elizabeth, pain and hope warring in his expression. Yes, I'm the father." "Then you can ride with us," the paramedic said, and suddenly Billy was climbing into the helicopter beside Elizabeth's stretcher, his hand finding hers as they lifted off toward Portland. I'm scared, Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible over the rotor noise. I'm here, Billy said, squeezing her hand. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, I'm here. Elizabeth wanted to pull her hand away, wanted to remind him that he'd already proven his presence was conditional and temporary. But another contraction hit, stronger than the others, and she found herself gripping his hand like a lifeline as their children fought to enter a world that wasn't quite ready for them. Below them, Magnolia Bay disappeared into the distance, taking with it the safety and peace Elizabeth had built over the past 7 months. Ahead lay Portland General Hospital, where 3 tiny babies would either fight their way into life or break their parents' hearts before they even had a chance to heal. They're going to be okay, Billy said, his voice thick with tears and desperate hope. All of you are going to be okay. Elizabeth closed her eyes and tried to believe him, even as her body prepared to deliver children whose survival would depend on machines and miracles and the fierce determination of babies who had no intention of giving up without a fight. Chapter 7. Rock Bottom. The NICU at Portland General Hospital was a cathedral of machines and miracles, where tiny warriors fought battles determining whether they'd see their first Christmas or their parents' faces without incubator glass barriers. Elizabeth gazed at 3 isolettes lined up like hope and heartbreak made tangible, each containing a baby so small they seemed more like delicate birds than humans. Sophia Grace, born first at 3 pounds, 2 ounces, her dark hair a perfect replica of her mother's curls. Oliver James, the middle child, at 2 pounds, 15 ounces, already showing his father's stubborn chin. Luna Rose, smallest at 2 pounds, 11 ounces, but with a fierce grip that wrapped around Elizabeth's finger the moment doctors allowed contact. They're beautiful, Billy whispered from beside her wheelchair, his voice hoarse from 3 days of alternating between prayer and panic. Perfect. They're absolutely perfect. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The babies were perfect. 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes each, lungs that were learning to breathe on their own with only minimal assistance, hearts that beat with the determination of fighters who had no intention of giving up. But they were also 8 weeks early, facing weeks or months in the NICU, and Elizabeth felt like she was watching her heart exist outside her body in 3 separate pieces. Mrs. Combs? Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead neonatologist, approached with the kind of gentle confidence that came from years of delivering impossible news to desperate parents. I have the latest test results. Elizabeth braced herself, her hands gripping the wheelchair arms until her knuckles went white. For 3 days, she'd been living in a state of suspended animation, caught between hope and terror as test after test determined whether her children would thrive or merely survive. The news is good, Doctor, Martinez said with a smile that transformed her serious features. All 3 babies are breathing well, their heart rates are stable, and the latest brain scans show no signs of complications. Sophia and Oliver should be able to go home in about 4 weeks if they continue progressing this well. Luna might need an extra week or 2. She's our little fighter, but she's also our most cautious about gaining weight. Elizabeth burst into tears, the first real tears she'd allowed herself since the helicopter ride that felt like a lifetime ago. Relief flooded through her body like warm water, washing away 3 days of the worst fear she'd ever experienced. "Thank you," she managed between sobs. "Thank you so much." Billy's hand found her shoulder, a gentle touch that she didn't have the energy to reject. For 3 days, he'd been a constant presence in the NICU, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, bringing her food she couldn't eat, and standing vigil over their children with the intensity of someone trying to will them to health through sheer determination. "Can I hold them?" Elizabeth asked, though she knew the answer. The babies were still too fragile for extended contact, limited to brief skin-to-skin sessions that left Elizabeth aching for more. Sophia's ready for another kangaroo care session, Dr. Martinez said. And Oliver's been showing signs that he misses his mama. His heart rate settles whenever he hears your voice. 20 minutes later, Elizabeth sat in the NICU's quiet corner with Sophia nestled against her chest, the baby's impossibly small body warm and perfect against her skin. The monitors showed how much the simple contact meant. Sophia's heart rate was steady, her breathing calm, her tiny fist curled around Elizabeth's finger like an anchor. "She looks like you," Billy said softly, standing close enough that Elizabeth could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "She has your determination." "She has your stubborn streak," Elizabeth replied without thinking, then caught herself. She'd been trying to maintain emotional distance, to remember that Billy's presence in the NICU didn't change the fundamental betrayal that had ended their marriage. Billy was quiet for a long moment, watching their daughter with an expression of wonder and devastation. "Elizabeth, I know this isn't the time or place, but I need you to know. I love them. I love all of you, more than I've ever loved anything in my life." "Love isn't enough," Elizabeth said quietly, her eyes never leaving Sophia's perfect face. "Love didn't stop you from signing those papers. Love didn't make you fight for us when everything was on the line." "I was terrified," Billy whispered. "Terrified that my mother would destroy you the way she destroyed everything good in my life. Terrified that staying would hurt you more than leaving." Elizabeth finally looked up at him, taking in the dark circles under his eyes, the stubble showing he'd been too worried about his children to care about appearance, the way his hands shook when he looked at their babies. "Do you know what terrifies me, Billy? The idea that our children will grow up thinking love is conditional, that they'll believe family abandons you when things get difficult, that they'll settle for people who run instead of fight." Sophia stirred against Elizabeth's chest, making tiny sounds that were barely more than whispers, but somehow contained entire worlds of need and trust. Elizabeth pressed a kiss to her daughter's downy head, breathing in the indescribable scent of new life and infinite possibility. "I want them to know they're worth fighting for," Elizabeth continued. "I want them to understand that real love doesn't come with escape clauses or expiration dates. I want them to be braver than their parents were." Billy's face crumpled, and Elizabeth saw the exact moment he realized the full magnitude of what he'd lost. Not just his wife or his marriage, but the chance to be the kind of father who modeled strength instead of fear, courage instead of cowardice. "How do I fix this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How do I prove that I can be the man you needed me to be?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, watching Sophia sleep against her chest, while Oliver and Luna fought their own battles in their separate isolettes. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but final. "You don't fix this, Billy. You accept that some things can't be undone, some trust can't be rebuilt, some choices have consequences that last forever." She looked directly at him, her dark eyes holding pain and strength in equal measure. "You be the best father you can be to these children, but you don't get to be my husband again. That man died when you signed those papers." The words hit Billy like physical blows, each one landing with the finality of a door closing. He stood there for a moment, watching his ex-wife hold their daughter, understanding finally that all the grand gestures and expensive apologies in the world couldn't undo the moment he'd chosen fear over family. "Can I—" he started, then stopped, his voice breaking. "Can I at least be part of their lives? Can I be their father, even if I can't be your husband?" Elizabeth was quiet for so long that Billy thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who'd had to grow up fast and make impossible decisions. They deserved to know their father. But they also deserve to see that actions have consequences, that love requires courage, that family means showing up even when it's hard. She adjusted Sophia in her arms, the gesture protective and final. "You can be part of their lives, Billy, But you'll have to earn that place every single day, and you'll have to accept that some bridges burn completely." Billy nodded, tears streaming down his face as he realized he was being offered the greatest gift and worst punishment imaginable. The chance to love his children while living with the knowledge that he'd destroyed any chance of the family he'd actually wanted. "I'll take it," he whispered. "Whatever you're willing to give me, I'll take it, and I'll be grateful for it every day of my life." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling Sophia's tiny heartbeat against her chest, and knowing that this moment was both an ending and a beginning. The family she dreamed of was gone forever, but the family she was building, fierce and protective and unbreakable, was going to be extraordinary. "Then be here," she said simply. "Be present, be consistent, be the father they deserve. But don't expect forgiveness and don't expect second chances. Some mistakes are too big for those." Outside the NICU windows, Portland stretched gray and endless under winter clouds. But inside, three tiny miracles continued their fight toward home, watched over by parents who loved them enough to build something new from the ashes of something that couldn't be saved. Chapter 8. The Real Work Begins. 3 months after the triplets were born, Elizabeth stood in the nursery of her Magnolia Bay cottage, watching Sophia Grace sleep in her crib while Oliver James and Luna Rose dozed in their swings nearby. The room was painted soft yellow with hand-stenciled butterflies on the walls, a project she'd completed during those terrifying weeks when the babies were still in the NICU and she'd needed something productive to channel her worry. The babies were thriving now, having spent 7 weeks in Portland before being cleared to come home. Sophia was already showing signs of being the trio's leader. Oliver was the charmer who smiled at everyone, and Luna was the observer who took in everything with serious dark eyes that seemed far too wise for someone who'd only been breathing outside the womb for 12 weeks. Elizabeth heard a car in the driveway and sighed, knowing without looking that Billy had arrived for his scheduled visit. Since the babies had come home, he'd been driving down from Seattle every Wednesday and Saturday, a 3-hour round trip that he made religiously, regardless of weather or work obligations. He followed her rules exactly. Called before coming, stayed only as long as she allowed, and never pushed for more than she was willing to give. But today felt different. Elizabeth had seen it in his text message that morning. "Elizabeth, I have something important to discuss. Can we talk after I visit with the babies?" She opened the front door before he could knock, not wanting the sound to wake the children. Billy stood on her porch holding the familiar diaper bag he'd learned to pack with military precision, but his usual composure was absent. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit wrinkled, his normally perfect hair unkempt. "They just went down for their nap," Elizabeth said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "You have about an hour before they wake up, demanding to be fed again." Billy nodded, setting down the diaper bag and moving toward the living room, where 3 baby swings held his sleeping children. Elizabeth watched him stop beside each one, his face softening with the wonder that still overcame him every time he saw them. Whatever else Billy was, he'd become a devoted father during these past months, patient with feedings, gentle during diaper changes, and surprisingly natural at soothing fussy babies. "They're getting so big," he whispered, careful not to wake them. "Sophia's already outgrown that yellow sleeper." "She's the appetite of the group," Elizabeth replied, settling into the rocking chair she'd bought second-hand and painted white. "Dr. Chen says she's in the 95th percentile for weight gain." Billy's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of doctor. Marcus Chen, the pediatrician who'd become much more than just the baby's doctor over the past few months. Marcus brought groceries when Elizabeth was too tired to shop, fixed her leaky kitchen faucet, and had started staying for dinner on Sunday nights with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged. "Elizabeth," Billy said, sitting heavily on the couch across from her, "I need to tell you something important." She waited, studying his face and recognizing the look of someone about to deliver life-changing news. Over the past month, she'd learned to read Billy's expressions, the difference between his work stress and personal anguish, between his attempts to impress her and his genuine vulnerability. "I've made some decisions," Billy continued, his hands clasped tightly, "about my life, about my finances, about what I want our children to remember about their father." Billy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a legal document. "I've established a trust fund for the triplets using the money I made from selling my personal investments, the ones I liquidated for those failed grand gestures. But more importantly, I've taken a job here in Magnolia Bay, construction work with Jake Morrison's crew." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. "You're moving here?" Elizabeth's stomach clenched. "What kind of decisions?" Billy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out two small velvet boxes that Elizabeth recognized with a jolt of memory. Their wedding rings, the simple platinum bands they'd chosen together when they believed in forever. "I wanted to return these to you," Billy said, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes, "and to ask you to marry me again, to give us another chance to be the family we were meant to be." Elizabeth stared at the ring boxes, feeling a familiar ache in her chest. For just a moment, she remembered the man who'd proposed to her on a beach in Mendocino, who'd promised to love her through anything, who'd made her believe that some love stories really could last forever. Then reality crashed back in, bringing with it the memory of divorce papers signed in secret, and 7 months of silence when she'd needed him most. "Billy," she said gently, "you know I can't do that. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust and destroyed what we had. But Elizabeth, I've changed. I've been in therapy. I've cut ties with my mother's business interests. I've been—" "Stop." Elizabeth's voice was quiet but final. "Just stop." She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the garden she'd been slowly restoring, her back to Billy and the ring boxes that represented a past she couldn't return to no matter how much part of her might want to. "You want to go back, Billy, but I can only move forward. You taught me that promises mean nothing when the first real test comes. I won't risk our children's security for pretty words and expensive jewelry again." Billy's face crumpled, the last of his hope finally dying. "Elizabeth, please, I love you. I love them. More than my own life." "I know you do," Elizabeth said, turning to face him. "And that's what makes this so tragic. You loved us then too, but it wasn't enough to make you fight for us when it mattered. Love without courage is just sentiment, Billy. Our children deserve better than sentiment." She gestured toward the sleeping babies, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They deserve to see that real love fights for what matters, that real families don't abandon each other when things get difficult, that real partners stand together against the world instead of sacrificing each other to it." Billy buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Elizabeth watched him fall apart and felt her heart break all over again. Not for the marriage they'd lost, but for the man he could have been if he'd chosen courage over comfort. "What do you want from me?" Billy whispered through his fingers. "How do I live with this? How do I wake up every day knowing I destroyed the only thing that ever really mattered?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, listening to the soft sounds of their children breathing and thinking about the question that would define the rest of all their lives. "You live with it by becoming the man they need you to be," she finally said. "You take this pain and you let it transform you into someone who fights instead of runs, someone who protects instead of sacrifices. You be the father who shows them what integrity looks like, what consistency means, what it costs to do the right thing even when it's hard." Billy looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "And you? What about us?" "There is no us anymore, Billy. There's 3 beautiful children who need their father to be better than he was, and 2 people who have to find a way to co-parent with grace and dignity." Elizabeth's voice was gentle but unyielding. I'm building a new life here, with people who show up when they promise to, who fight for what they love, who understand that family isn't just about blood, but about choice and commitment and daily acts of love. The implication was clear. Marcus Chen was part of that new life, part of the chosen family she was creating for herself and her children. Billy's face went pale as he realized he wasn't just losing his wife. He was watching her build something beautiful with someone else. "Can I still see them?" Billy asked, his voice breaking. "Can I still be their father?" "Always," Elizabeth said firmly. "They need you, Billy. They need the best version of you that you can possibly become. But they also need to understand that actions have consequences, that some mistakes can't be undone, that love requires more than good intentions." Billy nodded, carefully placing the ring boxes on the coffee table like offerings that had been rejected by the gods. "I'll go," he said quietly. "I'll let you get on with your life." "Billy," Elizabeth called as he reached the door. "The therapy, the self-reflection, the work you're doing to become better. Don't do it for me. Don't do it to win me back. Do it for them and do it for yourself. Do it because you deserve to be the kind of man who can live with his choices." After Billy left, Elizabeth sat in the quiet cottage, listening to her children sleep and feeling the strange peace that came with final endings. She'd closed a door today that could never be reopened, but in doing so, she'd also freed herself to walk fully through the one that was already open. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter, and inside, three tiny miracles slept peacefully, surrounded by love that was fierce and protective and unbreakable. Love that would teach them they were worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth the kind of daily courage that builds real families, one choice at a time. Chapter 9. The test, 15 months after the triplets were born, Billy Combs stood on the roof of the Magnolia Bay Community Center, his hands rough with calluses that would have horrified his former self, his back aching from 8 hours of installing solar panels under the October sun. The work was honest and hard and exactly what he needed, a reminder that some things in life had to be built from the ground up, with patience and persistence and no shortcuts. "Looking good up there, Combs," called Jake Morrison from the ground below. "You might actually make a decent contractor if you keep this up." Billy grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove. A year ago, Jake's casual acceptance would have seemed impossible. A blue-collar foreman treating the former CEO of a billion-dollar company like just another worker. But Billy had earned his place on Jake's crew through 12 months of showing up early, staying late, and learning skills his manicured hands had never imagined they could master. He climbed down the ladder as the workday ended, his movements efficient and confident in a way that had nothing to do with boardrooms or trust funds. Physical labor had changed him, not just his body, though his formerly soft physique was now lean and strong, but something deeper. Working with his hands had taught him the value of things that couldn't be bought, only built. "Same time tomorrow?" Jake asked, packing up his tools with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work for 30 years. "Wouldn't miss it," Billy replied, meaning it. The community center project was almost finished, a complete renovation that would give Magnolia Bay's children a place to learn and play and grow. Elizabeth had designed it, Billy was helping build it, and their children would someday use it. The symmetry felt like redemption, even if redemption wasn't exactly what he was seeking anymore. Billy drove his used pickup truck, purchased with money he'd earned rather than inherited, toward the cottage where Elizabeth and the children lived. Wednesday evening dinner had become a tradition over the past year, a careful routine that allowed him to be part of his children's lives without overstepping the boundaries Elizabeth had established with surgical precision. He'd learned to read those boundaries like a map to forbidden territory. He could help with bath time, but couldn't linger afterward. He could read bedtime stories, but couldn't tuck them in. He could kiss their foreheads goodbye, but couldn't kiss their mother hello. It was a careful dance of proximity and distance that reminded him daily of what he'd lost and why he could never get it back. The cottage looked different as Billy pulled into the driveway. Elizabeth's garden was in full autumn bloom, the result of months of patient cultivation that had transformed the neglected space into something magazine-worthy. More telling was Dr. Marcus Chen's sensible sedan parked beside Elizabeth's car, a reminder that Billy was visiting his children's home, not his own. Billy knocked softly and waited, listening to sounds of domestic chaos that meant his 18-month-old triplets were awake and energetic. The door opened to reveal Elizabeth looking slightly frazzled but radiantly happy, her hair escaping from a ponytail, flour dusting her apron, and a smile that lit up her entire face before she remembered who she was looking at. "Billy," she said, the smile dimming slightly but not disappearing entirely. "Right on time. They've been asking for Daddy all afternoon." The word Daddy still sent a jolt through Billy's chest, not because it was unexpected, but because he'd earned it through consistency and presence rather than biology alone. His children knew him, trusted him, reached for him with the easy affection of toddlers who understood that some people could be counted on to show up. "Elizabeth," he said, stepping inside and immediately being tackled by three small bodies, moving with the determination of tiny linebackers. "Daddy! Daddy!" "Up," Sophia demanded, her dark curls bouncing as she raised her arms imperiously. She was the leader of the trio, the one who decided what games they'd play and which parent would be subjected to which adorable manipulation tactics. Billy scooped her up while Oliver tugged on his jeans, and Luna patted his leg with the patient persistence that was her trademark approach to getting attention. For a moment, the cottage filled with the happy chaos of children who felt loved and secure, and Billy allowed himself to imagine that this was his life, that he belonged here in this warm space filled with laughter and the smell of whatever Elizabeth was baking. "Dinner's almost ready," Elizabeth said, disappearing into the kitchen where Billy could hear Marcus's voice explaining something about pediatric development in the easy tone of someone completely comfortable in this domestic space. Billy followed his children toward the kitchen, listening to Sophia's stream of consciousness narrative about her day. "Mama made cookies, but Luna threw one, and Oliver ate dirt, and I helped water flowers," and feeling the familiar ache of being present but not belonging. Marcus Chen stood at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven, his sleeves rolled up and an apron tied around his waist that read, "World's Okayest Cook," in cheerful letters. He looked up when Billy entered, offering the warm smile that had probably made him an excellent pediatrician and definitely made him an excellent partner for Elizabeth. "Billy," Marcus said, extending his hand for the firm shake that had become their ritual. "Elizabeth said you finished the solar installation today. The whole town's going to benefit from that project." "It was a team effort," Billy replied, meaning it. 12 months of therapy had taught him the difference between false modesty and genuine collaboration. "Jake Morrison did most of the heavy lifting." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Still, it's good work. Important work." Billy appreciated that Marcus didn't condescend to him, didn't treat him like a former rich boy playing at being useful. Their relationship was cordial but not warm, respectful but not friendly, the careful dynamic of two men who loved the same woman and children but had chosen very different roles in their lives. "Daddy, look." Oliver toddled over, carrying a wooden block tower that Luna had apparently helped him build, based on the way she was hovering protectively nearby. Billy knelt down to examine the tower with appropriate seriousness, praising Oliver's engineering skills, while Luna beamed with pride at her contribution. These moments, when his children treated him like any other father, when they shared their small accomplishments with the expectation that he'd be interested and proud, were worth every sacrifice he'd made over the past year. Dinner was a pleasant affair, filled with the kind of easy conversation that came from people who'd learned to navigate complicated dynamics with grace. Billy updated them on the community center progress. Marcus shared funny stories from his pediatric practice, and Elizabeth talked about her latest architectural project, a school library in Portland that would incorporate sustainable design principles. It was exactly the kind of evening Billy had dreamed of during those early months after the triplets were born, when he'd still believed that grand gestures and expensive apologies could fix what he'd broken. Now he understood that this dinner table wasn't his place to claim, but a gift Elizabeth allowed him to share, a privilege he'd earned through consistency and respect rather than entitlement. They were cleaning up when Billy's phone rang with a number that made his blood run cold. Cordelia Combs, the woman he'd been deliberately avoiding for 6 months, whose calls he'd stopped returning after their final confrontation about his disastrous life choices. "I have to take this," Billy said apologetically, stepping onto the cottage's front porch for privacy. "Mother," he said, not bothering to hide his lack of enthusiasm. "William." Cordelia's voice was crisp with authority and barely controlled fury. "I'm in Magnolia Bay, and I want to see my grandchildren. Immediately." Billy's heart stopped. "You're what?" "I'm sitting in the parking lot of some dreadful little motel called the Lighthouse Inn, and I have no intention of leaving until I meet the children you've been hiding from me for over a year." "Mother, you can't just—" "I can and I will. Those children are Combs' heirs, whether you've chosen to honor that legacy or not. I've been patient long enough." Billy looked through the cottage window at his children playing contentedly in their living room, at Elizabeth and Marcus working together to load the dishwasher, at the peaceful domestic scene that Cordelia's presence could shatter with her particular brand of toxic manipulation. "No," Billy said quietly. "Excuse me?" "I said no, Mother. You don't get to demand access to my children. You don't get to show up uninvited and expect accommodation. And you certainly don't get to disrupt their lives because you've decided it's time to play grandmother." Cordelia's silence was deafening, the kind of pause that usually preceded her most devastating attacks. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the chill of Arctic wind. "I see your year of playing construction worker has addled what little sense you had left. Very well, William. If you won't bring the children to me, I'll simply have to introduce myself. I'm sure their mother will be reasonable once she understands the benefits of maintaining family connections." The line went dead, leaving Billy staring at his phone and realizing that his biggest test as a father was about to begin. Chapter 10. 3 Little Miracles. The confrontation happened at the worst possible time and in the best possible place. Elizabeth was loading Sophia, Oliver, and Luna into their car seats outside Dr. Chen's pediatric office after their 18-month checkup when she noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour. The driver sat motionless behind tinted windows, and something about the vehicle's expensive lines made Elizabeth's instincts prickle with unease. "Mama, why sad?" Sophia asked, picking up on her mother's tension with the uncanny awareness that toddlers possessed. "Not sad, sweetheart. Just careful." Elizabeth finished buckling Luna's harness and was reaching for her keys when she heard heels clicking on pavement behind her. "So these are my grandchildren." Elizabeth turned slowly, knowing before she looked that Cordelia Combs stood behind her. Billy's mother was perfectly composed as always, her silver hair immaculate despite traveling from Seattle, her designer coat likely worth more than most people's monthly salary. But what struck Elizabeth wasn't Cordelia's obvious wealth or calculated intimidation. It was the desperate hunger in her eyes as she stared at the 3 children she'd never been allowed to meet. "Mrs. Combs," Elizabeth said carefully, positioning herself between Cordelia and the car, where her children sat chattering to each other in their mix of real words and toddler gibberish. This is unexpected. I've been watching, Cordelia said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. For weeks now, learning their schedules, their routines, the people in their lives. Her gaze moved over the children with the intensity of someone cataloging precious assets she'd been denied too long. So, Cordelia said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, these are my grandchildren. Elizabeth felt every protective instinct in her body activate simultaneously. Sophia, Oliver, and Luna looked up at this stranger with the curious wariness that toddlers reserved for people who felt dangerous in ways they couldn't articulate. Sophia, always the leader, moved slightly closer to Oliver, while Luna reached for Elizabeth's hand with the unconscious gesture of a child seeking security. Mrs. Combs, Elizabeth said carefully, not confirming or denying the relationship, but positioning herself between Cordelia and the stroller. This is unexpected. I'm sure it is. Cordelia's gaze moved over the children with the intensity of someone cataloging assets. They're beautiful. They have the Combs bone structure, though I see they've inherited their mother's coloring. The pause before coloring was deliberate, designed to remind Elizabeth that she'd never been considered worthy of the Combs name. But Elizabeth had spent the past year building a life where her worth wasn't determined by other people's approval, and Cordelia's veiled racism bounced off her like rain on glass. They're perfect exactly as they are, Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Cordelia stepped closer, and Elizabeth saw the exact moment when the older woman's composure cracked slightly. I've missed so much, Cordelia whispered, her voice carrying genuine pain beneath the imperial mask. First steps, first words, first birthdays, my own grandchildren, and I know nothing about them. For just a moment, Elizabeth felt a flicker of sympathy for the woman who'd orchestrated the destruction of her marriage. Cordelia was 70 now, and beneath the expensive clothes and perfect makeup, she looked fragile in a way that spoke of loneliness and regret. But then Sophia looked up at her and asked, "Mama, who is the scary lady?" In the clear voice of a child who'd learned to trust her instincts, and Elizabeth's sympathy evaporated. "Someone who's just leaving," Elizabeth said firmly, beginning to push the stroller away from Cordelia and toward the safety of the farmer's market. "I don't think so," Cordelia said, her voice hardening as she moved to block Elizabeth's path. "Those children are Combs' heirs, whether you acknowledge it or not. They have rights to their heritage, to their family legacy, to—" "Stop right there." Billy's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, and Elizabeth turned to see him striding across the town square with the kind of purposeful determination she hadn't seen from him since the early days of their relationship. He wore his work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that smelled of honest labor, and his face carried an expression of absolute resolve. "Mother," Billy said, positioning himself beside Elizabeth and the children, "I told you not to come here." Cordelia's mask slipped entirely, revealing the desperate fear beneath her manufactured authority. "William, these are your children. My grandchildren. I have a right—" "You have no rights here," Billy interrupted, his voice carrying across the square and drawing the attention of the entire farmer's market. Vendors stopped arranging their displays, customers paused their shopping, and Elizabeth realized that whatever happened next would become part of Magnolia Bay's permanent folklore. "You lost any claim to these children when you chose to destroy their family before they were even born," Billy continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You fabricated evidence, threatened an innocent woman, and manipulated me into making the worst mistake of my life. You don't get to play grandmother now." Cordelia's mask slipped entirely, revealing the desperate fear beneath her manufactured authority. I've been alone for 3 years, Elizabeth. 3 years of rattling around in that empty house, of having no one to call, no one who needs me. I destroyed the only family I had left because I was terrified of being forgotten. Her voice cracked slightly, and Elizabeth saw the exact moment when Cordelia's composure began to crumble. "Those children," she whispered, gesturing toward the car where Sophia was making faces at Oliver to make him laugh. "They're my only chance to matter to someone again. I don't know how to be a grandmother. I barely knew how to be a mother. But I'm so tired of being alone." "You made yourself alone," Elizabeth said, but her voice had lost some of its hardness. "You chose control over connection, fear over love." "I know," Cordelia whispered, and for the first time since Elizabeth had known her, the older woman looked fragile rather than formidable. "I know exactly what I did and why I did it, and I hate myself for it every single day. But I can't undo it. I can only beg for the chance to be better." The town square had gone completely silent, everyone frozen by the spectacle of one of the most powerful women in Seattle falling apart in front of a farmer's market. Elizabeth found herself holding her breath, watching Billy's face as he processed his mother's breakdown. "You didn't lose me because you couldn't control me, Mother," Billy said gently. "You lost me because you tried to. Love isn't about control. It's about trust and respect and letting people make their own choices, even when those choices scare you." Cordelia's perfect composure cracked completely, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the grandchildren she'd never been allowed to hold. "Can you forgive me?" she whispered. "Can any of you forgive a foolish old woman who was so afraid of being forgotten that she made everyone want to forget her?" Elizabeth looked at Billy, saw the pain and hope warring in his expression, and made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Cordelia," she said quietly, "forgiveness isn't something you ask for. It's something you earn through actions, not words. If you want to be part of these children's lives, you'll start by respecting the family they already have. You'll understand that I'm their mother, Marcus is part of their family, and Billy is their father who's earning his place every day through consistency and love." Cordelia nodded frantically, hope blooming in her red-rimmed eyes. "Yes, anything. I'll do anything." "Then get down on your knees," Elizabeth said simply, "and apologize to the woman whose life you tried to destroy. Apologize for the lies, the manipulation, the months of terror you put me through while I was pregnant with your grandchildren. Make it real, make it public, and make it count." The entire square gasped as Cordelia Combs, a woman who'd never bowed to anyone, slowly sank to her knees on the rough pavement of the town square. She looked up at Elizabeth with tears streaming down her face and spoke words that carried the weight of genuine remorse. "Elizabeth Helena, I am profoundly sorry. I was cruel to you. I lied about your family, and I nearly destroyed the most precious thing in my son's life because I was too cowardly to face my own fears. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for the chance to earn it. I'm begging for the opportunity to love these children the way I should have loved you, unconditionally, protectively, and without trying to control their future." Elizabeth looked down at the broken woman kneeling before her, then at Billy's face where pride and amazement warred with old pain, then at her children who were watching this adult drama with the solemn attention of toddlers who understood that something important was happening even if they couldn't name it. "Stand up, Cordelia," Elizabeth said gently. "If you're serious about earning forgiveness, you'll start by treating yourself with the dignity you should have shown me from the beginning." Cordelia struggled to her feet, and Elizabeth surprised everyone, including herself, by reaching out to steady the older woman. "You can meet your grandchildren," Elizabeth said quietly, "but you'll do it on their terms, in their home, with their parents setting the boundaries. And if you ever try to manipulate or control any of us again, you'll lose them forever. Do you understand?" Yes, Cordelia whispered. Thank you. Thank you so much. 2 hours later, Elizabeth sat on her cottage porch, watching an extraordinary scene unfold in her backyard. Cordelia Combs, still wearing her designer coat, but now with grass stains on her knees, was helping Sophia build a tower out of blocks, while Oliver showed her his collection of rocks, and Luna demonstrated her ability to walk backward in circles. Billy sat nearby, close enough to supervise, but far enough away to give his mother space to build her own relationship with his children. Marcus had appeared with coffee and homemade cookies, settling into the domestic scene with the easy grace that had made him such a perfect addition to their family. "They like her," Billy said, wonder in his voice as he watched his mother laugh at something Sophia had said. "Children are remarkably good at recognizing genuine remorse," Elizabeth replied. "She's not performing anymore. She's just being a grandmother." Billy was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter explain to his mother why rocks needed names and personalities. "Elizabeth," he said finally, "I know nothing's changed between us. I know I can't undo what I did or earn back what I lost, but thank you for letting her meet them, for giving her a chance to be better than she was." Elizabeth studied Billy's profile, taking in the changes that a year of honest work and genuine reflection had wrought. He was still handsome, still carried himself with confidence, but there was something fundamentally different about him now, a solidity that came from understanding his own worth rather than having it defined by others. "You're different," she said simply. "I hope so," Billy replied. "I hope I'm the kind of man who deserves to be their father, even if I'll never again be the kind of man who deserves to be your husband." Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, not love returning, but the final piece of forgiveness falling into place. "Billy," she said gently, "you'll always be part of this family, not as my husband, but as their father, and as someone who finally learned that love requires courage. That's enough. That's more than enough." As the sun set over Magnolia Bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth watched her children play with their grandmother and their father, while the man she'd chosen to build a new life with brought everyone cookies and made sure no one felt left out. It wasn't the family she'd dreamed of when she'd stood at an altar 5 years ago, promising forever to a man who hadn't yet learned what forever meant. But it was something better. A family built on choice rather than obligation, on respect rather than control, on the daily decision to show up for each other even when it was complicated and messy and required more grace than seemed humanly possible. Sophia, Oliver, and Luna would grow up knowing they were worth fighting for, that real love required courage, and that some of the best families were the ones people chose to build together from the beautiful wreckage of their original dreams. And sometimes, Elizabeth thought as she watched Billy help his mother navigate the complex negotiations required to share toys with 3 determined toddlers, the most extraordinary miracles were the ones that taught everyone involved how to love better than they'd ever thought possible.